Hey everyone, my name is Saurabh Sanghvi and I'm an associate partner with McKinsey and Company. And I focus all of my time doing work in education, the future of work and reskilling. And so it's my privilege today to be at ASU GSV, albeit remotely with everyone, and having this conversation with Katie Burke, who's the Chief People Officer at Hubspot. And not only is she an amazing and inspiring people leader, but I've learned that she's also a fellow MIT Sloan alumni, which has really excited both of us. And so
we promised we didn't coordinate that.
We thought we would cover a variety of topics, including diversity, equity, and inclusion, the future of work, the impact of COVID. And so maybe, Katie, without further ado, why don't you introduce yourself and maybe start with, how you define diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Saurabh, and thanks to the ASU GSV team for having us. Super excited to talk about future of work. As far as diversity goes, I think diversity, from my perspective, is not just about who is in the room, but also who has a voice in the room and how it's heard and rewarded. And then I think about equity and inclusion. That's really about, I think of it as, does the company or organization conspire to see you succeed and thrive and grow? And so I think when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we often talk too much about just getting people in the door and not enough about what the experience is like when folks actually get there. And I think, honestly, there's an overemphasis on events and programs and an underemphasis in things like performance reviews, pay equity evaluations, and some of the kind of meat and potatoes, as it were, of actually the way systems work and how they perpetuate power in a company.
And Katie, with that in mind, what are some specific actions that you've seen HubSpot take or other companies take to kind of do some of the best practices that you're talking about?
Sure. So this is, a very basic hack, but we've long looked at pay equity data, but we never put it in the hands of our directors to actually analyze before they hit submit. And so one of the things we did that's very simple and costs no money is in the Excel tab where you're making recommendations around, or Workday tab, whatever system you're using for HRIS, or Excel tab, whatever you're doing, adding tabs to make sure that people are tabulating based on gender, based on underrepresented minority status, and just reminding people so that before you're hitting submit, you're actually psychologically aware of what you're committing to and what that looks like. And I think pushing that down in organizations and really empowering directors and managers with that information and context makes a really big difference. The other thing I will say that I'm really proud of is that HubSpot, one of the things we have heard is that people want to be a great ally. They don't always know how. It turns out that talking about race for most Americans is awkward, it's clumsy, and people aren't sure they're going to get it right, and the stakes feel really high. And so one of the things we've invested a lot of time and energy in is building anti-racism training for all of our employees, but also for our managers. So we have a language around how to talk about race, how to confront bias, how to learn and educate yourself so you're not putting the emotional burden on our employees of color. And I think those are two relatively simple hacks that any organization can implement to make their organization more equitable.
I like both of those hacks. And so, one of the topics I want to get into a little bit is gender and race in light of COVID. And so, of course, research has shown that, more racially diverse, more genderly, inclusive teams are correlated with strong performance. And at the same time, if you look at the data and if you look at COVID in particular, that's, created a lot of challenges for both of those topics. And so we at McKinsey, some of my colleagues working with the Lean In Foundation just yesterday launched a lot of research on the women in the workplace. And some of the headlines that I'll just kind of read out are, as a result of COVID, 1 in 4 women are considering to downshift their careers or leave the workforce due to COVID-19. That's even staggering for mothers. So 1 in 3 mothers are thinking about downshifting. Mothers are more than 3x likely than fathers to be responsible for housework and caregiving, not very surprising. Then if you look at that was just women, but if we look at women of color, the data shows that they're more likely to be laid off or furloughed. And they're, Black women in particular are less likely to get support from their managers when we compare that to other races and whatnot. And so when we think about what was even happening before COVID, and if you look at a lot of the progress, there was a lot of movement towards, gender equality, but there was still a lot of, gaps between when you look at, real improvement as it meant for racial improvements and really having inclusive improvements for women of color. And so, with all that in mind, what do you think can be done to address the challenges for women in light of COVID, but specifically for, Black and Hispanic women?
I think the first thing is calling out the importance of what you just said, which is I think when we talk about gender progress, what we've historically meant is really progress for white educated women. And so I think part of it is just being super explicit about what you said, which is initiatives to advance gender equality in organizations often really solve for white women. And so I think first it starts with acknowledgement and awareness that programs that support gender are really just often perpetuating systems and opening up access to people who already had a fair amount of privilege to begin with. But the second thing, to your point, is acknowledging that this pandemic has impacted the workforce and educational institutions fundamentally differently for individuals of color. And there are, of course, millions of contributing factors to that. But I think as an organization, all of us have a responsibility to ask, specifically on gender, we'll start there, on caregivers, how do we make sure that they don't face undue burdens and get penalized essentially twice by the pandemic by increased expectations at work and then increased expectations at home, especially when so many school-age children and daycare facilities are closed or going virtual. And so some options that I've seen that I think have worked really well are just allowing people any sort of flexibility you can, providing no meetings days, giving people flexibility on how and when they work. So for example, we have some employees who are working later in the evening or early in the morning and kind of segmenting their shifts to make a big difference there. I think a little bit of flexibility goes a long way on retaining caregivers. And then I think the other thing that's really important is just to set norms on boundaries. So one of the things we've started doing is, in addition to our parenting coaches that we provide and a lot of insight in talking about normalizing caregiving during this time, we're also just doing things like, if someone puts up a cute kid emoji on Slack, that's a good sign not to bother them, and normalizing people, including senior leaders. So, for example, Dharmesh Shah, our co-founder, missed one of our executive AMAs in COVID because he was responsible for watching his son. And he was really, to your point, we know that in most heterosexual households that women are carrying the caregiving load, just even modeling having male executives participate in caregiving, but also talk about it in the workforce. I think those little things make a big difference.
And I want to go back to some of the things you highlighted earlier around the importance of allyship and even changes as they relate to performance reviews. Have you seen any examples that HubSpot has piloted or that you're thinking about experimenting with that you'd recommend to the audience?
Yeah, so on the allyship side of things, I think one of the assumptions, particularly as it relates to race, is that people only want to talk about race when Black Lives Matter is happening. In other words, when the stakes are super high and when race is in the news. And so one of the things we've tried to normalize is a little bit of like, how do you have dialogue? So one of the simplest things I think people can do is diversify who they follow on Twitter or LinkedIn, or what books they're reading and what authors they're referencing. We have a concept at HubSpot that we call name dropping. If you ask most people in tech who they name drop, it's Steve Jobs and people like that. And it's like, instead, how about if you're name dropping folks who don't necessarily look or sound or act or operate like the entrepreneurs we all grew up thinking and glorifying. And so I think the very act of name dropping and being able to reference amazing women of color that you look up to in your organization, interviewing them, getting them to be a part of your conversations makes a big, big difference. And then I would just say, again, just training people to have those conversations around race. So a good example on this front is we talk about race a lot from an employee perspective. We don't talk about it enough from a consumer perspective. So one of the things that we've tried to start talking more about HubSpot is, how do our Black customers and partners and prospects feel about our brand? Mm-hmm. Let's ask them that question. And so it would normalize you and I in a UX meeting saying, who did we talk to for this research? Whose opinion do we value? How do we make sure that our BIPOC customers and partners feel a part of this conversation? And so I think conversations about race don't always have to be about talent. They can also be about your core business proposition as well.
I love that. Who are some people that you've been name dropping lately?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me think. A few folks that I have really loved. So Ta-Nehisi Coates has been hugely influential on our anti-racism curriculum. We're proud. He just moved to Boston to build out the anti-racism center at BU. So obviously we're a little bit biased, if I'm being honest. Stacey Philpott, the former CEO of TaskRabbit, is someone that I really admire. And then I think, honestly, those are a few women that I really admire. And then honestly, I'm really proud that at HubSpot, we have 3 women on our board. So we're really proud that, to name drop, you don't just have to go outside our organization, you can look inward. But those are some of the folks that I really admire and that we're really excited about. And then folks like Dantley Davis, who is the Chief Design Officer at Twitter and is really passionate about not just gender inclusion, but race inclusion as well. Those are some of the folks that I'm watching, listening to, and learning from.
That's great. I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and it's one of the things, Katie, that we were talking about even before the conversation around remote work in general. And so your remote work poses interesting opportunities and challenges, and we're still learning the ins and outs of what all that means. And I think one of the things that was surprising to me, which shouldn't have been surprising, but was surprising, was that when you look at actually a lot of the research that's been done, despite the pandemic, in the US, there's about 60% of the workforce that can't be remote, whether that means that they're on the front line, whether they need to have a physical presence, et cetera. So we're not talking about, large parts of the population necessarily. But for a company like HubSpot, I imagine, a large part of your workforce is remote. And so would love to kind of maybe start with the fun question, which is give you, the opportunity to stare into your crystal ball and, what do you think the new normal for work is going to be? And maybe to narrow that a little bit, maybe work would be at HubSpot.
Yeah, so I think to your point, it's important to be mindful about who gets the optionality in any workforce. I think that's important to be mindful of. But as I think about HubSpot and a lot of tech, I think a few things are going to happen. One is I think that there's going to be a higher emphasis on career growth for folks who work remotely. So I think one of the downsides of working remotely has been that there's been a trade-off for your upside within an organization based on where you lived and where your zip code was. And I think that trade-off is going to go away, and we'll see more senior executives and VPs working fully remote, which I think honestly is a really positive trend and something we're going to want to see more of. And then I will also say, I think we'll see more people living where they truly want. So I think ski towns in America, I think beach towns, lake towns, places like you're visiting right now where people are soaking up the fresh air. I think those have historically been vacation destinations or summer or winter places for people. I think more people are going to make a home and make work where they live and where they want to live. And then the other thing I think that's actually going to be a good outcome of all of this from an equity and inclusion perspective is, in spite of how much everything at work has changed, I still think that there's been historically a lead partner in a relationship and then someone who makes trade-offs. So if you think about doctors who match after medical school, often their partners are left kind of going, okay, I'm going to move to whatever city that person matches in. And I think one good thing about this is that now there's a little bit more dual career flexibility for partners that are in dual career couples who also want to have great lifestyles and potentially raise kids as well.
I hadn't thought about that, but I love that, and I think that's a really exciting opportunity. One of the challenges that I've heard a lot of companies, and especially CHROs and leaders of parts of organizations talk about is, how do you create inclusive environments when you're behind a screen? And especially how do you do that for people that don't have established relationships? And so I'd love just a little bit of how, Katie, you're thinking about that and any tips or tricks you have for companies on that topic.
Yeah, so I think one important thing to acknowledge from the start is that a fully remote environment can actually have huge upside for inclusivity. So for example, for folks who identify as introverts, or for folks who, for example, may have had accessibility challenges entering a traditional workforce, there are huge opportunities and upside in a fully remote environment. With that said, if you're not intentional, I think bias can still creep in. So someone has a great quote about microaggressions being different. So they may not be in person. They may be more over Slack. They may be about not inviting someone to something. And so microaggressions by exclusion are still microaggressions. I think the other thing to keep in mind is that your informal networks in the absence of more structured in-person events become even more important. And so you could see a scenario where because we both went to Sloan, I have to make a quick hire. I'm like, oh, he would be perfect. I'm just going to make a move quickly here. And so one of the things we're actually being really intentional about is running webinars for our new BIPOC employees to make sure that they get the same access to the HubSpot network internally as any other new employee who might start if they were starting in office. And I think some intentionality behind that makes a big difference. I would also say the importance of mentorship and sponsorship becomes more important than ever. It's critical that there be people in your organization voicing support and actively going to bat for BIPOC folks, particularly as we know that our manager and director and VP and C-level ranks are not as diverse with underrepresented voices as we would hope.
Yeah, and you started with this, but what are some of the positive side effects that you've noticed from more of the remote environment?
I mean, I think on the positive side of things, like on the caregiver side, I think, you and I are just getting to hang out today for this panel. Normally it would take a while to invite someone into your kitchen, but hey, here you are, and here, thousands of people at ASU, GSBR. And I think that actually brings up some good opportunities for human connection. So I have seen and met more children and partners of my coworkers at scale than I ever have before. And I think there's something really wonderful about that. There are very few people that I've ever met where I haven't met their child and loved them even more, loved working with them even more. And I think the same is true of like pets, getting to know the ins and outs and quirks of where someone lives. You were hearing that I live near a hospital, so sometimes there are the occasional sirens or ambulances going by. And I think there's a little bit of charm to that. There's an element of humanity that you wouldn't get otherwise when you have to bring your professional self only to work. And so I think there's some benefits. The other thing I will say on the accessibility side of things is I think, honestly, our parents and caregivers have said that the lack of obligation to go to after work stuff is actually quite freeing. So those informal networks of people who would stay out and have dinner can actually create a lot of opportunities. And so if you're able to attend more, we certainly at HubSpot have way fewer evening events or morning events. And so the ability to do more networking during the day in more kind of enclosed settings, I think is actually good for some folks who are both more introverted, but also people who are caregivers and don't want to necessarily go out or socialize after work.
And what have you been seeing around the topic of mental health? That's been a topic that has come up a lot in the news. At McKinsey, it's something that we're actively working on in the remote environment. What are you hearing from employees? What are some of the things that HubSpot's doing to address, supporting mental health?
I think I'm so glad you asked about it. I think McKinsey and HubSpot are not alone. I think if we're being honest, this has been a trying time for everyone. And then when you add to it social injustice, when you add to it the anxiety and depression that comes along with the uncertainty of the pandemic, then when you add things like caregiving, there's an increase, as you probably know, in domestic violence, in addiction. There's just a lot going on in the world. And so I think it's so important to acknowledge that and, again, to normalize that and talk about it. And then I think it's also important that organizations provide resources for support. So a few things that we've done at HubSpot, in addition to just making sure people know about the counseling services and mental health resources that we have available, is we've actually held dedicated sessions on things like how to maintain a healthy body image during a global pandemic, how to make sure that you're maintaining boundaries and self-care. Sleep in a pandemic has been a real leading indicator of additional depression and anxiety, and so really focusing on sleep and recovery has been helpful. We've done more physical health seminars than ever before, and on the mental health side of things, we've brought in professionals to just talk about what it looks like to set good boundaries, how to talk about your anxiety and depression to your manager, and just really normalizing those conversations, I think, is a great idea. The other thing that's really resonated with me is I think there's this concept. Remember the banana bread and Tiger King section of quarantine?
Yes.
That was sort of the time when it felt like everyone was crushing it but you. Like everyone was making 4-course meals and their family was loving it and everyone was kind of doing great. And I think one good thing that's come out of this is a little bit of the concept of the Buddhist second arrow. So basically the pandemic you can't avoid, that's the first arrow. The second arrow is all the guilt and anxiety you put on yourself by saying oh, everyone else is crushing it and making perfect meals and I'm not. And I think I've been working really actively within our team to normalize talking about that, to say, I'm not having a great week. I'm feeling stressed about next year. I'm feeling stressed about the holidays. And I think it's important for people and leaders to talk about how they're feeling, so it doesn't feel like if you are someone who's struggling, you're the only person who's feeling that way.
Yeah, I can resonate with a lot of those, and I think the waves that you're talking about is something that we've seen where there was a cumulative effect to just the pandemic, a cumulative effect to all the various things that were, hitting various groups at the exact same time. And so being mindful of that, creating space for it, showing role models is very much things that we've been trying to do at McKinsey too. So maybe I'm just looking at our time. I'll transition us to another topic and get into just, broader future of work trends. So as you know, we've been doing a lot of research on the future of work, looking at things like how automation may impact jobs, skills, what's happening with digitization. And we just recently did a survey of 800 executives around the world. And what we found was that, 85% of companies globally believe that COVID's actually going to accelerate digitization. 67% said that it's going to accelerate automation. And even before COVID, there was some staggering challenges from the future of work, where a lot of our research highlighted that, up to 40 million jobs could potentially be displaced. The impact of that automation would have disproportionate impacts on folks that had low education attainment levels, disproportionate impacts on women and minority groups. And so, would love to first start with maybe what we asked in the survey, which is, what are you seeing at HubSpot in terms of the acceleration of some of these future of work trends, and how is that impacting HubSpot's business?
Sure. So I try to be an optimist on this stuff. So I will just say on the automation and digital acceleration, I think there are opportunities here, not just challenges. And so when we think about the move to a more digital world, I actually think there's huge opportunities. So one of the things we've been talking to our customer base about is how do we make sure that the next generation of folks who are digitally savvy, who are marketers, sales professionals, I think as we move into a lower code world, the barriers to being an engineer or someone who ships code actually could potentially be a lot lower, which could be great for folks who are learning to code for the first time. So I was reading earlier today about some programs that are focused on helping incarcerated or recently incarcerated folks learn to code. I think one of the challenges has been becoming an engineer used to feel like it was here. And don't get me wrong, if you're trying to do super advanced work, I'm sure it still will remain that way. But I think that there's actually a huge opportunity in a more digital world for more people to have access to that world if we do it right, if we have an emphasis on inclusive skills training, if we're thoughtful about making sure that we reduce barriers to entry on things like requiring a bachelor's degree or emphasizing where someone went to school. And so I think if we can be inclusive in our hiring process, the digital world has huge opportunities and upsides for equity and inclusion, but we have to be intentional about it. I will say on the automation side, we've always thought about it as automating the things that matter less so you can focus more on the things that really matter to your customers. So by way of example, our customer support team is not going to go away. Our customers love them at HubSpot. What will go away are a lot of the nuance or little silly tools that, or tasks that people are doing on a regular basis. And the same is true of being a manager. I'm sure for you, you're approving expense reports, doing a bunch of things that still honestly feel a little bit archaic. And so I think there are some things that are going to get automated that are actually good to free up all of our respective times. I do think, though, that your caution on automation in particular is notable. So one of the things that we talk a lot about is in a machine learning world, and just in any input to output world that's getting automated, it's not creating more bias, it's automating the bias all of us have. And so we're essentially training any sort of system to replicate the bias that already exists. And so I think one of the things we've been talking a lot about at HubSpot is how we create next generation tools that make us better, not worse on that front. And I think the good news is we're having hard conversations about it. I certainly don't have all the answers, but I do think it's something that all of us should be worried about. I hope, like the return or like the remote work switch, it includes some upside, but also some things to be mindful about.
And I want to follow up on that, Katie, that last point, because I actually wholeheartedly agree with, the promise of a lot of technology, of digitization and automation is actually, if you look at all the activities that we're performing, there's still a lot of things that just are taking a lot of time and are not actually, useful or very positive impact generating activities. And so there's a whole opportunity for technology. At the same time, kind of your caution, right, of if we continue to build these systems, like who are the people who are building these solutions? What kind of bias may be part of those types of tools? Who has access to those tools? what are the types of support services that we need to be able to provide to people so that they can take advantage of those tools and make it so that technology actually is driving equity, not propagating inequity. And so, as you've thought about that, either for HubSpot or other contexts, what are some ideas that you think both companies, education institutions, other organizations could explore to make sure that we don't fall on the wrong side of that challenge?
Sure. So I think the first thing is who you ask to do the work, right? So if the team that is doing the work isn't diverse, you can expect them to produce better outcomes than we're currently generating. And so one of the things that we're actually trying to do is really start with the user experience side of things and user research side of things. So we actually did in-depth interviews with a bunch of our BIPOC partners and customers to really understand the nuances of their experience, to get a ton of granular feedback on what's working and what isn't. And we use that as the grounds to start what we were building and what that looks like. And from my perspective, I think who's on your team makes a big difference on that front. Not surprisingly, we had much higher response rates from people when there was a BIPOC individual on our team reaching out to say, we'd love to hear your experience. I think who's on your team really matters. And then I think how they go about testing their assumptions really, really matters on this stuff. So one of the things we've been working on is when we're creating models, really testing what they're telling us and not infusing our assumptions. So I think, correlation versus causation is the most famous assumption, obviously, that you're dealing with, I'm sure, with your clients daily. And one of the things that we talk about is, okay, just because the data told us a certain thing, so even with our people analytics data, if something tells us that an input makes for the most successful employee, we are not taking that assumption as is. We are then double clicking on what that actually means. Did that person get different training? Did that person get different access? Maybe it goes back to the networking and opportunities they were given. And so I think just not taking the data at face value makes a big difference too. So I think it's about the team and then the assumptions you make going in and then how you test the assumptions of the first iterations of a model or automation instance.
That makes a lot of sense. Katie, I think we're getting the 2-minute warning. So I want to jump to the rapid fire part of this session. And so I'll hit you with just some questions, would love your reactions. And so first one, want to end a little bit more on a positive note. As you think about, the conversation that we've had, what are you most energized or looking forward to in the next 6 months?
I'm most excited that opportunity and zip code will over time be less correlated.
What's one action that you would recommend to the audience to show their commitment to DEI today?
To DEI, look at who you're following and who you're retweeting and whose voices you're amplifying. Those little things make a huge difference.
All right. And then the last one is, what's your favorite memory from Sloan, MIT Sloan?
My favorite memory from MIT Sloan is actually, I actually was lucky enough to take class with Jack Welch, and taking class with him, you can imagine he was a, let's just say, interesting and dynamic instructor, but I loved every minute of it, and getting to learn from his wisdom was really powerful and really influential and had a huge impact on my career.
Well, thanks, Katie, for the great conversation. This was a lot of fun, and looking forward to continuing to hear more about your insights and where HubSpot heads next.
Thank you. It's always fun to chat with a fellow Sloanie. Thanks for all the work that you do at McKinsey and all the great research you all are providing to help inform our work.
Thanks.